slide and let you advance it. But so in any case, we're going to talk about the election. We're going to talk less about the outcome than we are about the some of the mechanisms of the election, how people chose to participate, and what I think the long-term implications of them are. So next slide. If you could advance the slides.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. So often academics these days are discussing this in terms of misinformation, disinformation, which is a productive, a good lens to look at an election through, but it only captures one side of the dimensions of American politics. So James Carey years ago talked about an information-based model of communication and a ritual-based model of communication. And to some degree, the misinformation, the debates about the information-based model, whereas what I'm talking about mostly would fall under the ritual model of communication. So next slide. So this is the team that I've been working with for the last 10 years. There's a whole army of graduate students underneath our top brass, but we've been working for the MacArthur Foundation to try to understand what role imagination plays in the political process. More broadly, what role affect plays in the political process. And we've been looking at both by studying things like campaigns and social movements and the ways they're mobilizing symbols and particularly things borrowed from popular culture. But we're also looking at it by going out in the field, doing workshops with various communities to get them to think about the future together and for us to understand the logic of how they're thinking about their aspirational lives. We're asking them to tell us what the ideal world of 2060 would look like. And in the process, we find out a lot about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their anxieties, what parts of the system they think their works, what parts not. I'm going to draw a little on both of those in this talk today. All right, next slide. So this work on imagination emerged from earlier work I did for the MacArthur Foundation on participatory culture. This is a word I've written about much of my career, um, but this is the first time I really developed a model of the pedagogical dimensions of participatory culture. How do people learn in a participatory culture? How can we define it around learning? And point one was relatively low barriers for engagement, strong support for sharing creations with others, informal mentorship, not necessarily from older to younger, but from experience to inexperience. And in fandom, say, we often find younger people more immersed in it and older people coming to it later in life and learning from, teens how to write fan fiction, say. Members believe their contributions matter, and this may be one of the most important dimensions of it. But they care about others' opinions of themselves and their work, and not every member must contribute, but all must believe they're free to contribute when ready, and that what they contribute will be appropriately valued. So it's not a culture where everyone participates. More and more, I talk about it as a more participatory culture. But things like fan communities, game communities, hobby communities online generally follow most of these principles, even if in sometimes by the exception that is in the breach. So they value these things. They don't always achieve them, but they hold each other accountable for whether or not they achieve them. Next slide. So we took that framework from MacArthur and turned it toward thinking about participatory politics. And coming out of it, as you see, there is our book, By Any Media Necessary, The New Youth Activist, which really dug in deep and did ethnographic studies of 5 different kinds of activist communities, the ways they were using new media, and the kind of overarching civic imaginations that constitutes them. Next slide. So this is from a report that MacArthur issued. The Youth and Participatory Politics Study defines participatory politics as interactive, peer-based acts through which individuals and groups must seek to exert both voice and influence on issues of public concern. Importantly, these acts are not defined and guided by deference to elitism or formal institutions. Examples of participatory political acts include starting a new political group online, writing and disseminating a blog post about a political issue, forwarding a funny political video to one's social network, or participating in a poetry slam. So this comes out of a report that was done. Unfortunately, the MacArthur funding for the work we were doing on participatory politics ended about 2016, more or less precisely the moment when we really should be looking at it most because of the churn that was created by Trump's first election. But we kept some of that work up through the work of the Civic Imagination Project. Okay, next slide. I'm going to just give you a little glimpse at the data of I'm not a data-driven quantitative researcher, but we have a lot of data from various sources about the electorate in America. And this one shows us how fixed the relationship is between Republicans and Democrats, that it shifts only a little, that there's a kind of expanding moderate Republican base, the so-called never Trumpers, that's grown over time. But the yellow in the middle are the percentage of voters who call themselves independent and may be choosing between candidates on either side. It gets smaller and smaller over time, and an inordinate amount of money and time is spent attracting independent voters in 8 states that basically determine the election because of their mix of electoral votes and the fact that they're more volatile than some of the other larger states. We know Florida is going to vote Republican. We know California is going to vote Democratic. But the states that are in play, you were trying to attack, the candidates are trying to attract that yellow circle, the yellow block of votes there. Next slide. Second thing you have to know about the US elections is that they're determined by less than half of the voters. So at the top, you see 22% voted for Trump, 21 or 20% voted for Harris, and it looks like 1% voted for a third party. But that 29% are not eligible to vote and 28% didn't vote. Now, this number is a little flexible. Votes are still being counted. We don't really know the popular vote outcome yet, but this is the best snapshot that people have come up with of showing that in one of the world's most vibrant democracies, less than half of the population votes. Next slide. This shows us how youth vote plays out. And I'm mostly going to talk about those young voters today. But you can see that around the time of Bush versus Gore, that they moved from a fairly neutral place where young people voted either way to a place where an increasing number of young people vote Democratic and a dropping number vote Republican, although there's some up curve in this last election cycle. And what's really at stake is overwhelmingly women, teen and 20 women voted for Harris. A slightly less than 50% of men in that age range voted for Trump. The gap between the gender gap in American politics is, smaller at the younger you get. Older men overwhelmingly voted for Trump. Men here voted for Trump more than they voted for Harris, but it's a much closer curve. Okay, next slide. And this is really hard to read on the screen, but what it shows us is breakdowns by race, by gender, by age. And if you could see the data, and I can't really read it anymore, it's too small on my computer screen, but it shows us that more that if we look at women, something like 52% or 53% of women voted for Harris, but 55% of teens voted for Harris. So the young people's, I guess teens and 20s, it's from 18 to 27 is that curve. But that slip, was the most reliable voter group for Harris in this election. Um, yes, more blacks than whites vote for Harris, but the numbers has been going down. More Latinos vote for Harris, numbers going down. The number that's still going up is the number of teens and 20 somethings who are voting for Democrats. All right, so that's a snapshot of this election. And it tells us a little bit about what the candidates and the campaigns were trying to do. So if Harris's campaign could mobilize significant young number of young people, and particularly young males in the swing states, that could have determined the outcome of the election statistically. That's not quite what happened, but it is what the Harris campaign was trying very hard to do. And I embedded myself in a advocacy group for Harris for the fall part of the election and was regularly at meetings. I could hear the discussions of how they conceptualized this group, what they were trying to achieve there. And I can tell you that almost all of the time at the advocacy group meetings I was at, they were focused on trying to get more teenage men for Harris. Okay, next slide. So one of the mechanisms by which the campaign tried to do this is through what we call fan activism. And you can see a variety of forms of it here. What we have here is some fan art, which projects Harris as a superhero. You had at least three major Zoom rallies that I can think of that were targeted for the fan community. They were more top down than I would have liked for something called fan activism, but fans did speak and spoke from the main podium during these events. But all three of them were billed as Comic Cons for Kamala. The one I participated in organizing was called Heroes for Harris, Geeks and Nerds for Harris, Women of Star Trek for Kamala. All of those were just the kinds of events that were spontaneously being organized by different advocacy groups trying to attract fans, and fans in many cases perceived as young men. So they had celebrity speakers from fantasy shows, science fiction shows and films, comic book creators, but they also had real political leaders, and ours had actual real world heroes, some of the whistleblowers and some of the cops who got injured on at January 6th and so forth, showing up and blurring the lines, and then fan leaders. And I spoke at the tail end of Heroes for Harris. But what we generally mean by fan activism, we're saying it's bottom-up activism. It's not from official campaigns. It's not from elite organizations. It is from grassroots organizations, many of which, and often through fandom in one way or another. So it's the public's activism, not the celebrity activism. And we'll get to celebrity activism in this campaign in just a minute. Okay, next. So to give us a better example of fan activism, let's think about the role that K-pop played in the 2020 election. K-pop fans, not just in the US, and this would become controversial down the line, but definitely responding to developments on the ground in the US, like some of the shootings of black people that took place in 2020. So next. So one of the kind of kicking off points of K-pop's involvement in the 2020 election was a rally held in Oklahoma, Tulsa, in which fans registered for many, many tickets, and it forced Trump's people to purchase more space and to exaggerate to the press that who was turning out, and they ended up with lots of empty seats, which looked bad on camera and so forth. So essentially, they get trolled or punked by TikTok users, many of whom were not even old enough yet to vote, but found a way to use TikTok to mobilize and get their voices heard in the election cycle. Next slide. One consequence of this fan activism, apart from making Trump look foolish, next slide, is the that it led to $1 million donation of the BTS to Black Lives Matter, and the BTS Army matched that donation and surpassed it. So $2 million worth of support for Black or pro-Black organizations emerged from this online activism. Next slide. So why? What happened? Well, first of all, Korean pop culture has emerged as a generational marker, really, for young people in America today. That it's off the radar of most older people, whereas young people sort of coalesce around K-drama, K-films, and K-pop as sort of markers of their identity. And so instantly, there's the possibility of reaching massive number of young people through K-pop, which ironically is not American media, but is playing some significant roles in American electoral politics. Next slide. Secondly, fandom provided a social infrastructure. Their fan leadership, their fan organizations, their fan networks, and those structures, that human power, allows fans to be a particularly strong interest group, shall we call it, in the election. Now, fans of different things have different interests, but fans as a whole are mobilizing collectively, one fandom at a time, to make a difference. We also see multiple fandoms being attracted by many of the geek-oriented Zoom rallies that were taking place in this election cycle. Next slide. There also was in the K-pop community at that time growing racial consciousness because there had been these controversies about K-pop stars appropriating black hairstyles that led to Black women, particularly in the US, using blogs and podcasts and video blogs to critique this practice and to educate significant portions of the K-pop fandom worldwide on the politics of race in the United States. If it had been another issue, I don't know, abortion might not have gotten K-pop fans globally mobilized, but this they were ready for. And this they were ready to engage with. And not just because they're good citizens, but because there's a history of bad behavior that they wanted to work beyond. Next slide. Then this group in particular has strong technological capacities. So much of K-pop fandom is about moving your guys up and down charts. They're, often the teams are put together on reality television where the public votes. You're trying to buy X number of albums so that the star breaks the top tier and into the top tier when the album comes out, so forth. This sense of an organized tech base gave them the capacity to do particular things around registration, say, that allowed the disruption of the Trump rally to occur. So what we're seeing is no accident of the topic, no accident that it's tech-based, registration-based, no accident that it's young people, and no accident that it's K-pop. All of those things came together to allow this group to be particularly effective at doing both at trolling Trump and making statements in support of Black Lives Matter during 2020. Okay, next slide. So this is arguably an example of fan activism. So is this image here from the Women's March in 2017, where you can see layers of pop culture signs being displayed. So that's Princess Leia's buns and eyes poking up there on the sign. And Leia's, we have signs saying, women's place is in the resistance. the idea of resistance goes hand in hand with Star Wars, particularly because Carrie Fisher has just died at this point, who plays Princess Leia in the Star Wars movies and so forth. But right in front of it is the phrase "history has its eyes on you," which is a song from Hamilton, which also was very, very popular in that time period and spoke to the growing political sensitivities of American youth. And then around the edges, we see some of the pink pussy hats that people learned how to make online as a protest against Trump's statement that, the women let him grab their pussies. So it becomes a symbol, particularly of women's resistance. But if you look closely, almost every major protest march today has cosplay, has the creation of signage based on pop culture references, and literally dozens of pop culture references. So, in some cases, this is cultural acupuncture. Cultural acupuncture seeks to identify and move the pressure points in the culture. It looks at how things are circulating and attaches it to things that are circulating widely. These are relatively superficial attachments, right? It's maybe just Princess Leia and the woman's place in the resistance, and there's not a larger mythology around it. But as Neda Kliegler-Villicek tells us, she was a grad student in my group, now a very important scholar in this space working out of Israel. She says that there's also fanish civics, which uses fan mastery and expertise in order to develop a stronger sense of mythology around a particular political issue. So both of those are part of this. All right, next slide, please. This is a global phenomenon. These are Indonesian students, I think. No, Thai students who are flashing the three finger salute from Hunger Games in protest of the government and in the face of unarmed militia. So this is a pretty serious use of pop culture by this generation. And what we're seeing is around the world, the younger generation is conducting politics through attaching itself to popular vernaculars drawn from pop culture. This is something I predicted at the end of convergence culture almost 20 years ago, that the skills that were emerging on the internet, which people were learning through their play, would be put to more serious purposes as they grew into adulthood. And in that book, I write about religion, and write about politics. And education is all illustrating the implications of the skills people were acquiring through participatory culture. And now we're seeing the manifestation of them. Next slide. Here, this is a group of Palestinians some years back marching through what they call the occupied territory, chanting, "Sky people, you can't take our land." And so the film borrows from indigenous mythologies. The Palestinians are borrowing from science fiction mythologies. And so there's a weird circuit here of connections between Palestinian struggles, Navi struggles, and the struggle of indigenous people. In this film, particularly indigenous people from Brazil. Next slide. This is a woman's places in the resistance, part of the Princess Leia imagery that was heavily used in the women's marches. Next slide. This is the streets of Hong Kong, where the umbrella movement made extensive use of a song from Les Mis. Can you hear the people singing? And so if you saw the video, this was a video, you would hear literally millions of people singing this song from a West End musical to protest against the official Chinese government. Next slide. And this is not just on the left. On the right, the kind of Viking sword-bearing mythologies, whether it's the Witcher or the Northmen, have proven to be very successful as symbols of white supremacy and Aryan dominance. And so we see someone like the QAnon shaman who participated in the January 6th invasion, insurrection, whatever we're going to call it, that is dressed like a mix of Celtic Nordic and Native American symbols. He's constructing his own cultural identity, but he does so by reading multiple other mythologies. And we can't directly connect him to the success of the Northman 6 months later with the far right, but there's good reason to think that that's part of the connections that are going on there. All right, next slide. So to build on what I just said, we can think about QAnon as an unfortunate form of participatory culture, one that has caused enormous disruption and even death, but that probably can be best understood as a fandom run amok. I'm pointing this out because so often when we talk about fan activism or we talk about resistance, the assumption made by cultural studies is it's progressive resistance. But I've always contended it could be on the right, it can be on the left. It's a set of tactics that grow out of a particular set of ideas about democracy, but that ultimately fandom is spreads across the ideological spectrum. So we can see the role of fan activism if we look at something like QAnon. Next slide. So in the middle there is a book, Q, written by the Wu Mi Min group out of Italy. This is a group that was famous for doing media hoaxes to stir up the right and to call attention to the inadequacies of their thinking process. The novel Q is about someone in a royal court who was leaking information to the people about the foibles and exploits of the powerful. Now, I can't directly connect Q to QAnon, but my underlying theory is that most likely it started with the novel and its fans, and that it was another media hoax, except one that went much further than any of the ones that the group had done in Italy. And it's picked up by blogs, by podcast. Someone is dumping data or cryptic data from the Trump administration, and folks of the far right, the MAGA persuasion, are picking up on it and using all of the mechanisms of participatory culture to rally the fans. And it's treated like cryptic Nostradamus messaging that only the elite fans can decode and call to public attention. But it uses all of the forms of communication that we talked about with the K-pop fans. Okay, next slide. And then the whole larger group gets activated, goes out in the streets, waves signs like "Hugh sent me," so forth. So that activation of the fans is part of what makes this an example of fan politics. Next slide. Now, we now know that the primary channels for the QAnon movement were 4chan and 8chan, both of which start as kind of fan troll spaces that are very in your face with their content, but originated initially from anime and manga fandom. So when this 4chan groups confront Scientologists, for example, you have a political movement that started in fandom confronting a religious movement that started in science fiction fandom, and it's taking place in the public streets and therefore becomes part of the national political scene. Next slide. Now, the opposite in many ways, although closely related, of fan activism is celebrity activism. And no moment sums this up in the recent campaign better than the moment where Taylor Swift endorses Harris, and it's just breaking news everywhere. That Next slide. And what's ironic is the Republicans had long fantasized conspiracy theories where Taylor Swift endorsed Biden at the Super Bowl. And so they've been waiting for this top-down moment where celebrity activism really comes into play. And it does emerge. Their worst nightmares emerged during the fall election. At the time, no one knew would the Swifties be moved to vote for a particular candidate um, because of her endorsement. Now, my theory at the time, and I think it's proven to be correct, was that celebrity endorsements call attention to a candidate, grabs the attention of younger voters who might otherwise not be tuned into the election, but they don't determine how they vote. That's a step beyond how we listen to celebrities. That fan activism for that is much better because it comes with peer pressure, it comes with an organization and a call to participate, whereas all that Swift is asking them to do is to vote. And it's less interesting for a generation that's been brought up on participatory politics to vote a certain way just because their celebrity did so. But next slide. You see here several others. This is the Bruce Springsteen endorsement. This is the Reese Witherspoon endorsement. There were one after another um, of celebrities endorsing Harris during the campaign. It's now believed that this was widely perceived among Trump voters as elitism, that this was, it kept reinforcing that Harris was a California girl and that she had access to the entertainment industry through that. And so she became, it reinforced the message of her as a coastal elite for those who didn't support her already. And it was not a particularly effective way of stirring up voters. Whereas the fan activism at least raised money for the campaigns, even if it mostly spoke to the converted. Okay, next slide. So another question as we look at the campaign is, wrote a piece with Nico Carpentier, who's a studies political participation. The question is, the title of the essay is, Why Does God Need a Spaceship? It's a line from Star Trek. And instead, I'm asking, why does Trump need Twitter? Why does the most powerful political figure in the world who has immediate access to the dominant media in the society, the mass media, need a form of communication which is participatory, which is low access, low bandwidth, but he's turned it into the voice of authority. And it's in part because he doesn't trust the journalistic world, he doesn't trust traditional media or legacy media, that he wants to find a way to route around him. And he thinks that this kind of using the same kind of platform that the voters are using, Twitter or now X, is a way of reaching them at their own level, reducing the gap and perspective between the president and a citizen. And the fantasy that these people have when they have thousands, if not millions, of tweets toward Trump is that he will see them, that he will read them. It's kind of like if only the czar knew. But it gives the potential fantasy that he does sometimes read and respond to these tweets. That allows it to feel like a much more democratic process and arguably mask the autocratic tendencies that we see in Trump. And this, I wrote this 4 years ago, this article, but what we'd seen this election is Mr. X himself, Elon Musk, has aligned himself with Trump, and we've seen two different kinds of power, corporate power and political power, working together, and now Elon Musk is reinventing our government. Very scary. Okay, next. Now, Trump has gotten into the crypto world in a major way, and he's creating these NFTs which come with these heroic fantasies of Trump. These are all images Trump's campaign and people produced of him. They have the feel of that Superman, Wonder Woman outfit that we saw Harris in before, but it's self-produced. And it's part of the many ways that we're creating heroic, mighty images that might as well be straight out of, say, socialist realist art for Trump and this campaign. But it's interesting that it's done through crypto, that's the real way he's engaging with significant numbers of people. Next slide. Trump also is aligning himself to religious groups, again by appropriating their imagery and inserting himself into it. So all of these are actual images circulated top down by the Trump campaign. but or then recirculated on a grassroots level, and including that one above where he's holding the Bible upside down and backwards and doesn't know it, which is a kind of funny image once you decode it. Okay, next slide. And then they were able to move quickly to merchandise the assassination attempt this summer and to use images that link all of this together. So the flag, the founding fathers, religious imagery, all is creates a cult of personality around Trump coming out of the assassination attempt. And it's another good example of Trump world communication. So Trump has plays it both ways. He has a very steady stream of top-down media production that is circulated through more social media platforms. And he's authorized people on the MAGA side to be able to create their own images, which are often more extreme in their racism and fascism than the images that would ever be released by the campaign. But because they're not by supporters and not the campaign, there's a plausible deniability. It allows the images to circulate and affect the campaign without being blamed directly on Trump or making it harder to blame them directly on Trump. Next slide. So what this brings us to what we call the civic imagination, right? Those heroic images of Trump are a particular way of representing autocratic politics. And Swapnil Rai edited a really interesting chunk of an issue of a Cinema and Media Journal from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, which looks at autocrats in the world today, across the world, and how they're using media and how they're using media that is traditionally associated with entertainment to glamorize themselves, and how they're using media that's traditionally grassroots to give the illusion of democratic possibility to voters you know, who are really ready to support the autocracy. So these are forms of what we call the civic imagination, and our project is trying to understand what role the imagination plays. Okay, next, in our political process. Next slide. So to do this, we need to think about what we mean by the civic and what we mean by the political. So the civic, the way we're using it is cultural, social, and it has to do with the ties that citizens or community members feel toward each other. And that's how it connects to Carrie's notion of ritual communication as ritual, is we need these rituals of social connections and fantasies of social connections, what Benedict Anderson would call imagined community, in order for people to come together and as a group of citizens. Next slide, please. So the political then is about institutionalized struggles over the distribution of power and resources, formation of law and policy. It's obviously going to be more overtly partisan than civic. Generally, we're thinking about that through institutional struggles, power struggles, political power struggles, but it also can be struggles between management and labor, producers and consumers. But the key thing is it's adversarial, whereas the civic tends not to be. So what tends historically happens in democracies is the political represents a threat or division. It it usually results in a split decision by the voters. They're not 100% behind their leaders, but and so there needs to be a process of healing at the end of an election where people accept the results, come together. But what we've seen in the last handful of elections is deeper partisan divides in the US than we've seen in a long time. I won't say ever. I think we could point to the Civil War and a few other moments in American history where those divides were that deep. But it's very deep divides and no time spent on healing. Trump, in particular, doesn't want to win over the people who voted against him, unlike almost every other president in U.S. history. Instead, he likes having a strong base who's constantly mobilized and at war with the left. So the result is the healing process we associate with the civic isn't taking place. And our work is trying to figure out the decision points and how do we mobilize civic engagement across political divisions that occur in American society, or how are people doing it, but also how are people mobilizing the imagination in the service of political issues. Next slide. So, what are the functions of the civic imagination? Well, one is you need to imagine a process of change. How do you bring about change? And these images are interesting. One shows the black woman who climbed the flagpole in South Carolina to take down the Confederate flag that's on the state flag. The other is Malcolm X as Magneto. And either you understand that connection or you don't, but it's a very deep connection about his tactics and politics and policies. Next slide. Then secondly, you need to imagine yourself as a civic agent capable of making change. And so again, superhero imagery. One is an anti-racist activist in New York who's Sikh and dresses as Captain America, but with a turban, to call attention to initially at protesting the See Something, Say Something campaign, which ended up with lots of brown people being falsely accused of being terrorists. And so he wanted to get people to recognize that even as a Sikh, he could be still an American hero. The second side is some of the branding around healthcare around the world that sees super emergency workers as superheroes. And so both of these are civic identities, ways that people can construct themselves, borrowing the resources of popular culture, but being used for both activism and for public service. Next slide.
Mr. Jenkins, I apologize for interrupting, but I just
Yeah.
wanted to gently remind you that there are 10 minutes remaining for your talk. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, this is taking longer than I projected, but we'll at least get through the functions of the civic imagination, and I'll say I will get there. All right, so next, before we can create a better world, we need to imagine what a better world looks like. And Wakanda was, for many fans in 2020, projected as what a better world for Black people might look like. Next slide. We have to forge solidarity with groups whose perspectives are different from our own. And here I'm just suggesting the range of different people who come together to form the Avengers on one side, and then the squad that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been building in the House of Representatives that includes the few Muslim representatives, Black representatives, Latina representatives, so forth. They both constitute alliances across differences. Okay, next slide. For those who are most oppressed, you have to imagine freedom, dignity, democracy, safety, participation before you can directly experience them. This comes out of the literature on the Black imagination. Uh, and here we see it most spectacularly in the Superman was an illegal alien immigrant language. Uh, you know, we prefer the term undocumented, but if there were an illegal alien, it would be Kal-El from the planet Krypton, whose parents sent him away to find a better life on another world, who, lands in a cornfield in Kansas, gets adopted by an Anglo couple, raised as a white family, but clearly is not white, and ends up going out fighting for truth, justice, and the American way of life, while wearing his ethnic symbol. Most contemporary Superman stories give different meanings to that S than was classically there. And in any case, he's wearing a costume made from the blankets his mother and father wrapped him in when they sent him to Earth. So all on so many levels, Superman is functioning as a metaphor for being undocumented in America today. And the curious thing is because it was created by first generation Jewish immigrants, the original Superman in the 30s, we're seeing this exchange of symbols from Jews in the 1930s to Latinos in the 2020s. Almost 100 years later, they've reclaimed the symbol that was about immigration all along and made it their own. Okay, next slide. You need to imagine yourself as part of a community with shared interest. And here we see a feminist community, we see the Occupy movement, and both found metaphors from pop culture, comics in particular, to achieve this function. Next slide. So people are calling this the first influencer election. The first one where young people's voices and young people adept at using media played decisive roles in the campaign. And part of the wisdom of the Harris campaign is it knew exactly how to pinpoint and mobilize these young people to give them a sense of participation. It was ultimately not enough to overcome the traditional politics, but it was in many ways a participatory politics versus institutional politics, top down versus bottom up, and the rivalry between the two candidates. Okay, next slide. So, a key element in this were memes, right? Memes, I don't like the word memes because of its ties to Dawson, who talked about them as self-replicating culture, and I think culture is human created, not self-replicating. And it's create memes are creative, not replicating. But we see that memes become central to the way the grassroots side of the Harris campaign in particular was conducted. Okay, next slide. And I was reminded when I saw this of the ways that the woodcut on traditional print culture functioned as a kind of meme, a compressed symbol for earlier generations of political activists. This is a meme. It is also a classic poster art symbol from, I think the Wobblies or something. Next slide. And we saw this quite early on as memes try to break through the false equivalencies of of the election, right? So imagine if Frodo was all Sauron's bad, but Gandalf's done some morally gray stuff too, so I'll stay home. Don't get eaten by orcs, vote. Next slide. Or look, this is later in the campaign where it's now Harris versus Trump. Look, I know Darth Vader belongs to the dark side and that he blew up a planet, but I just don't know enough about Princess Leia. So these are designed to push at the false equivalencies that are often mouthed by undecided voters. Next slide. Here we see extensive use, and so many of the participants are women, and reproductive rights on the table. So we see extensive use of Handmaid's Tales to talk about the same thing. I know, but I just didn't like her laugh, or this phrase, we can disagree and still be friends, that people have started to break down on the internet. Next slide. Or they're used to express fantasies, like Nancy, the kind of banal, which is often read as a very banal comic strip, actually a very creative one. But here, this artist who remixes Nancy cartoons every day on the internet, he has a series of Nancy cartoons where she fantasizes Trump in jail. Next slide. Okay, next slide. And this is another one that fantasizes what happens to the Trump if he was defeated in the election. Just walks out into the ocean. So, next slide. One of the biggest things that affected the internet during the campaign was Vance made a statement that the Democratic Party mostly consisted of childless cat ladies, and that gave the internet a rallying point where young women in particular could take that Catwoman metaphor and just run with it in a variety of different ways. And this, what we see here includes official media, legacy media, includes op-ed pieces, and it includes memes, but they're all circulating through social media on the same circuits by the same people. So since we argued in spreadable media that the acts of circulation are forms of participation, then we stand by that, and I'm treating editorial cartoons here as functionally equivalent to memes. Again, they're looking for ways of visualizing crisply a particular theme of an election. And so we'll go through a couple of more of these and I'll stop. Okay, next slide. So here's another Harris vision of Harris celebration of childless cat ladies. Next slide. There they're using Freya, the Norse goddess, as a symbol for the childless cat lady. Okay, next slide. Cats for Kamala as a bumper sticker. So again, memes can pop off of the digital screen and rematerialize in physical space, then things like bumper stickers or hats, which happened a lot during this election cycle. Next slide. And then ladies, we ride at dawn on November 5th, which is the election day. So what we see is the cat ladies get mobilized. There's the list that I get a lot of my memes from during the election is called childless cat ladies. So when the cat ladies mobilize, then there's memes spitting out at an incredible rate throughout the internet. Seemingly memes that are responsive to key themes of the campaign day by day. You could actually do an entire history of this campaign just by looking at the memes. And the memes are also taking critiques of Harris, turning them into strengths. So the idea that she's got a crazy laugh becomes a campaign about joy. And they're constructing images, anti-fan images of Trump and the other members of his circle to turn negative lens on what he's saying and to break down the logic of the MAGA positions. So all of that is to show that participatory culture and politics plays a very active role in this election, much more than we've seen before. That fan activism and celebrity activism are working together to mobilize the imagination and get people involved in the process. And it still failed. And that's the thing that I have to end with because while I'm excited about all of this and what it means for democratic political participation, it wasn't enough by itself to overcome the basics of this election, the bad economy, the sense of disaffection that many people in the middle of the country feel, the fact that Harris is tied to the Biden so decisively and he's so unpopular. All of those things outweighed this now. But this was, in some ways, an experimental election. And I think we'll see all of these practices normalized in the next few elections as Democrats try to learn from their loss and figure out what tactics are going to work well. And with that, I am done. I'm sorry that I ran long, but hopefully giving you some things to think about. Yeah, I mean, it goes on and on. I over prepared.
Thank you for your deeply compelling presentation. And I'm sending you thanks of my colleagues and friends here. And we will reserve a few minutes for the questions and answers.
Yeah, I can't do
İzleyiciler-
much of this, but maybe we can fit in 10 minutes worth of questions and answers because I've got
Okay,
to go to my doctor's appointment.
okay. İzleyicilerimiz arasından sorusu olan var mı? Ha, just a minute.
I'm sure at least it's something
I'm,
controversial and all of
we
that.
have a question for you.
Okay.
Given your extensive work on fan culture, how do you envision fan-driven political movements evolving over the next decade? What opportunities and risks do you foresee as AI and other emerging technologies further transform participatory politics?
All right, I would say at the most basic level, AI poses that threat of the deep fake, which is actually more likely to be mobilized by the campaigns than by the fan groups around them, just because they have more to gain from that. But it's definitely going to be a factor. We're going to see images and we're going to have to develop. The place this talk originally ended was critical media literacy, right? We're going to have to develop skills, understand where images come from, who's producing them, for what purposes, which very much is part of the media literacy goals all along. So there's a particular set of civic media literacies that the Participatory Politics Research Network that MacArthur created out. And they have to do with the use of collective intelligence to investigate, to share knowledge, so forth. That wasn't what we saw emerge yet, but probably could be. The second thing that's important about AI and all of this would be that a tool like Midjourney or any of the other visually generative AI programs are allowing more people to visualize their perspective than ever before. Back in the first Obama campaign, I talked about Photoshop for democracy. What I'm seeing is now Midjourney for democracy, that we can, people who have no artistic ability can still use Midjourney to create compelling images, to dramatize themselves. And if this is indeed, as Yoda told us, the meme war has started, then the capacity to generate the precise images you need to create a meme is going to be a powerful tool, powerful knowledge, powerful resource in future election cycles in the US and around the world. The biggest danger, I think, of fan politics would be the fact that it's so emotionally driven that and its symbols can take on a life of their own when the symbols are already fan based. I don't think in most cases I've looked at, there's a loss of perspective. The fans are using the images from pop culture, the way Martin Luther King used images from the book of Exodus, to, let my people go, I've been to the mountaintop, etc., or the way the US founding fathers have used the classical Greek and Roman orators and, the debates about Athenian democracy and so forth. These are stories we use to dramatize our politics. They're not a substitute for politics. So the fan-based activist groups are really encouraging, they're using this to call attention to issues, but they're asking people to read more deeply, and they're providing study guides and other things to make sure that members are aware of where to go to get more information, to critically engage and verify claims that might be made by memes. Now, memes in circulation outside of an organizational context are much harder to do that with. We need the capacity to put a footnote on a meme or something that actually draws people back to research and grounding in the real world. But I think as a way of mobilizing people and sparking awareness and engagement, it is a powerful tool for the younger generation of citizens in countries around the world.
Thank you for this great answer. Thank you for Professor Jenkins for just such an engaging and a thought-provoking presentation. Your insights into fan activism, participatory politics, and civic imagination have given us much to reflect on, particularly in the context of today's political landscape. Thank you also to our audience for your attention and thoughtful interest. This session has truly highlighted the importance of dialogue in the understanding the intersections of media, culture, and politics. I hope you leave here as inspired as I am. And with that, we conclude this session. Professor Jenkins, I thank you also on behalf of my colleagues and students here. And have a wonderful day. And thank you again for joining us.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed sharing some of these ideas with you, and I'm always drawn, as I said earlier, to Turkish audience and the state of the debate as it exists there. So,
thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
bye.